Welcome to another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem, the podcast that goes behind the scenes of the fantasy football industry through interviews with some of the best in the business. On this episode, I was joined by Chad Parsons of Under the Helmet, the website and the show. You could also know him from Footballguys and the Dynasty Think Tank Show. We had a great chat about his lifelong passion for animals, the differences between redraft and dynasty, being an only child, drafting Randy Moss and Dante Culpepper, playing sports as a kid, podcasting for the first time, running a fantasy football website, and much more. Follow Chad on Twitter at Chad Parsons NFL. You can follow me, Kacey Kasem, at DKCKasem, and the podcast at GetReal_pod. You can find my content with Rotoballer, Fantasy Six Pack, South Harmon Fantasy Football, and Optimus Fantasy. And check out SundayDreamersClub.com for some awesome fantasy football inspired t-shirts and sweatshirts. This podcast is a proud member of the DAP Network. And now, here's my conversation with Chad Parsons on Get Real with Kacey Kasem. And if you hear any sort of yawning or any sort of sighing, my dog's in here. He's very upset that he had to be downstairs by himself. Yeah, it's the dog. It's not me. It's not me. I'm not sighing. It wouldn't be me. We have Chad Parsons here today. I am so excited to get to talk with him today because I've been following him for a very long time. Back in the day when I was just a fan of the game of fantasy football, Chad was one of my go-to guys. So I'm just very thrilled to get to talk to him. And we're going to get to know you right now, Chad. I know you're excited about this one. Let's talk about your childhood. Where'd you grow up and what was it like?
Wow.
Yeah.
You started out by calling me old. That's what I heard first.
If you're old, I'm old.
Okay, well, we're definitely not saying that. Kacey is very young at heart. I had a what's interesting is, have more of a nomadic lifestyle, a lot of travel and a lot of different places all times of year right now. And what's funny is I kind of grew up that way. My dad was in the California state park system. So, and this was back in the heyday probably of the 80s where, state parks weren't, now they're, not funded all that well. The conditions aren't that good. But back then, California state parks, a lot of that was beach related there on the coast. And so I think it was something like 10 different houses, 10 different locations in the first 12 years or so by the time I got to like 7th grade. So I was already someone that I had to try to, I'm not good at fitting in per se, but I had to have a lot of different situations of just finding my way of this year, I might've only been at the school for a year per se. And fortunately I was able to stabilize in high school and have those 4 years. It was kind of a different situation for our family, but California kid, grew up a lot of times close to the ocean. Yet not really an accomplished surfer or anything like that. But yeah, I was always someone that had to kind of, at least in terms of survival, entertain myself. I was always that kid that would sort baseball cards or when Nintendo came out, I was creating my own, stat sheets for Nintendo baseball, things like that. Or just playing basketball by myself, just because a lot of times I might have, we didn't have functional neighbors that had kids my age, or it was just always, I had to be very self-reliant for entertainment and just all of that outside of school or sports or anything like that. So it was a really interesting childhood compared to a lot of people that I've talked to that they might have lived in the same town the entire time. I knew the same people in first grade that I knew when I graduated high school. And that's the complete difference, which I find both are kind of fascinating to the other side of it. And it's the same thing if you grow up with a bunch of brothers and sisters versus you're an only child. So I was an only child, and I always find it interesting that I was kind of, you could say, very isolated, and yet you say eventually he's going to turn to a podcast host that interviews people, and it comes off, at least when I'm in my zone of comfort for a topic or an event or something, that I do come off as far more sociable or far more interactive than maybe some of my more isolated upbringing might indicate.
All right, only children. That's interesting to me because my wife's an only child and I have a sister, and we're 2 years apart. So we grew up, playing sports together and doing all that stuff. So it's interesting to hear the other side of that. Were you into watching sports as well when you were growing up? I know you were playing Nintendo and setting all, doing the stats and all that, but were you into watching sports as well?
Oh, absolutely. I remember my dad was more, I think, again, he kind of watched everything, but it was more of a baseball and football house, I would call it. I still remember like we would have Monday night would be either like Mexican night or pizza night or something where that would be like the night we would actually go and we'd watch football during dinner. Like that was not a commonplace thing. We were the around the kitchen table type family for 90 something percent of dinners. But yeah, I mean, I remember my dad he liked the San Francisco Giants enough to get like Giants Vision, which was like this special, it was almost like Sunday ticket, I guess, or, if it was for one, you pay for the whole season or something. But yeah, we were very much a sports family in terms of consumption and, just being interested in what's on. Like I was growing up, I was a Chicago Bulls fan, they were on NBC all the time. And so we would do that. And, until a certain point, I mean, I kind of tried most of the sports. Soccer I gave up on, but like always being like open to, and that's something like I see kids now and it's like they talk about specialization so early, and it always kind of bothers me because like being a kid, like I remember, hey, yeah, you threw the football around, but it was like football time of year. If you had enough kids, you played basketball, you played, some form of baseball, whatever that was. If that was, any sort of home run derby, whatever version you played, but you played all these different sports, at least two or three of them, everybody in the neighborhood, whatever neighborhood that was. And now it's like, it feels like if you don't specialize by the time you're like 7, 8 years old, it's like, well, you're not going to turn pro or get a scholarship. And it's like, in 1984, we weren't thinking about getting scholarships. We were just thinking we were having fun with our friends. And it wasn't like this high pressure thing. Yeah, you were better at something. Like I might have been better than my friend Patrick at, baseball, but he was better at football or whatever. But we weren't thinking about making our school team or getting a scholarship or having a high recruiting score or any of that stuff. I think that people get obsessed with, the parents as well, these times. So I just think, like, for example, I would say the thing I'm highest in is a pretty high level tennis player. And what's funny is coaches will say like, oh, it's kind of like this. And they'll reference, if it's throwing a football, or they'll reference throwing a baseball. And what's funny is there's a lot of really good, 10-year-old tennis players. They have no idea how to throw a ball. It's like, well, so you didn't sit and play catch with your dad or with your friends when you were 5 years old, 8 years old? It's like, no, I went to a tennis academy and then I took lessons and I don't know. Like, I feel like some of the fun of sports has been sapped out for these younger kids. And it's just because, you're trying to get a scholarship that's going to cover $250,000 of college tuition, or you actually think you're going to make it pro or something. And it costs you, 10 to 12 years of taking a few more sports a little less seriously.
Yeah. I played all kinds of sports as a kid, and I'm not good at any sports really, but it was so much fun to just try.
Sometimes it takes you to like your 30s, right? And you join like a kickball league, right? Or something like that. And you're like, and you end up having fun, and then you hang out afterwards and you do it once a week and you do it for part of the summer. Like if we had that, or, you'd say, hey, I'm going to play ultimate Frisbee. Like, yeah, not everyone's great. You're not part of like professional league or anything. It's like, so it's almost like sometimes you have to have that, 10 to 30-year-old break. And then you can kind of go back and kind of have fun with stuff again. It's kind of a weird kind of life circle for some of these sports where you can just kind of go into it and be like, have some fun, and, you can try to play well and all this stuff, but just have fun with your friends again.
So when you were playing sports with your friends when you were growing up, what was your favorite sport to actually play? Even if you weren't good at it, was there something that like really was the most fun for you?
Growing up, it was probably basketball. I was the kid that I think at 2 or 3 different stops, especially the one from like, let's see, it was like 6th grade to like 8th grade. And then the one in high school as well, when we moved up to Eureka, California, both of those places I had basketball hoops. And so if you're a kid with a basketball hoop, like you invariably can have people over, but you always have something to do. And so I was always the kid that, I was practicing my shooting, we'd play 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, or like my dad would come home and like every once in a while we'd play 1-on-1 in the driveway. Like that was, or just like pick up stuff like that. So basketball was always the most accessible, where baseball, it's a little more logistical. You can't really sit there. Even with wiffle ball, your parents would get upset. You bang them into the windows, they go up on the roof and the gutters and they go over the fence. So accessibility wise, basketball was always a little easier. And I was never, I don't know, your experience with different parents and stuff, but my parents were never I never formally asked if I could play football. Now, sometimes my friends and I, we played tackle, but it wasn't super frequently when I was growing up. So I was not accustomed to the like, oh, you wrestle and like, I think that's more of like if I had a brother that was within 2 years of me, we probably would have wrestled in the house and be like, knock that off, all that stereotypical stuff. But I never formally asked to be on the football team or anything. So that was the one that kind of eluded me. I did more of the like 2-hand touch, or like we played in the street where obviously it's not tackle and stuff like that. So that was the one sport that I would say I was really interested in, and I watched it and I followed it and all that. But in terms of playing, it was it's almost like if you only did flag football these days, which I know they're doing that a lot more for youth. They're growing up with flag football, and you can certainly transition over to the full version. But that was the one that I always had abbreviated versions. I wasn't like the kid always like looking forward to violence and tackling my friends and stuff.
So when you were growing up, did you have sports heroes or certain players on teams that you were big fans of?
Do you remember those books when it would be like remembering first grade or whatever, like you have the picture of you, like the official school picture, and then you'd write like, what do you want to be when you grow up? What's your favorite, sports team? What was your favorite teacher? I remembered a few years ago looking back at that, and then you stuff your report cards in the top and never look at those again. But I remember looking, and every time it would change based on like, I was such a fair weather fan. Like I would literally write like, it was like the year, the Bears won the Super Bowl. It's at 85 or 86 or whatever. I'd like, Chicago Bears. And then I'd write the Giants when they won the Super Bowl. And then like when the Bills were going to the Super Bowl every year, it's like, I love the Bills. Like, so I was very fair weather at the time. I didn't have a lot of the one thing growing up that I don't know how common this is or what it says about my wiring, but like my dad was a big 49ers fan. And for some reason, I don't know if it was like they were the equivalency of, the Patriots with Tom Brady or something. But I just remember back then Montana and then Steve Young, like they were always so good. They didn't win the Super Bowl all the time, but they were just so good. And I just hated that. Like I was like, I can't be a 49ers fan. And I was actually like the most opposite fan you could possibly be back then, which was the Atlanta Falcons. Because that was the old NFC West. That was when you had to get like you couldn't watch on regular TV. I mean, you got your local, like I could watch the Raiders, I could watch the 49ers, and then like one other team, like whatever they chose basically. And then Monday Night Football, like those were the only options for watching it. So you're talking about being a fan of a team that I could literally only watch when they played the 49ers and lost by 30. So how I came up with this, I don't even know, but I did like the prime time stuff. I like the run and shoot offense, and I like the uniforms, which is obviously very important if you're 10, but,
right?
But it was very frustrating because the ticker, and people these days, I mean, you don't even understand. Like it's not that they didn't even show clips. You wouldn't even get the update like during halftime. A lot of times you would just get the clicker at the bottom saying there's 3 minutes left in the second quarter and here's the score. I don't even think you got player stats or anything. And then you'd have to look up in the newspaper the next day to find, how many catches they had and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I was a Falcons fan when, I mean, I like the offense and the uniforms and Deion Sanders and all this kind of stuff, but they got trounced. The only games I got to watch were getting trounced by the 49ers a couple times a year. So that was, I still don't know. Like I wasn't like a anti-establishment, anti-parent, all this stuff, like just trying to pick the opposite type kid. But I just, for some reason, the 49ers right in front of my face and, just being there and being successful, that didn't do it for me for some reason when I was growing up largely.
So are you still a fan of the Falcons, or do you?
No,
Yeah. I was just wondering because
a lot of Falcon, a lot of analysts in fantasy, like you start covering all 32. So to some degree, you have to kind of put that aside. But what I will say is it just became too much for me emotionally. Like, honestly, like they actually got to the Super Bowl. If you remember that big upset against the Vikings, that monster Vikings team. And then they lost to the Broncos. That was I think, was that Elway's last game? I can't remember if that was the first one they won. I think it was the second one in 98. They had already beaten the Packers the year before. So Falcons finally got to the Super Bowl. So again, a lot of strife going through that whole era. And then the Dirty Birds finally get to the Super Bowl. I missed this that game against the Vikings because I was at the airport. It goes to overtime. I have to get on the plane. I actually, as a 19-year-old or whatever I was, I thought about missing the flight because I was like, when am I going to get a chance to see this? They ended up coming back, like I thought the game was over. They get the announcement that the game on the flight is going into overtime. And I was like, how did that happen? I didn't even ever get to watch that game. YouTube was not really a thing. Replaying the game on regular TV was not going to be a thing. So it took me years to actually track down and watch that fourth quarter plus the overtime, because they were down by 7-10 at the point that I couldn't watch. And then the Super Bowl, I still remember, again, huge underdogs. I think that was the Eugene Robinson got into trouble or something. Like, Falcons did everything wrong. Like they were going to get blown out. They did get blown out. And I remember in my dorm room, I was so upset. And I was like, what are we doing here? What are we doing? I was like, and now I look at fandom and I'm like, so the only fans that are truly happy are the teams that win it all, right? Because if you get to the playoffs and lose, you get to the Super Bowl, you get to the finals, whatever it is, and lose, I mean, the journey was great. You ultimately didn't win. I mean, if your team is just bad all the time, what is this? Like, so part of me questions that whole thing. Yeah. Like how much fun is it really? And then the other part for me was like, so I started doing fantasy a little more, and then the Michael Vick era was very frustrating because he wasn't really to some degree, he wasn't really a quarterback. He was very exciting. He got hurt all the time. And so that up and down journey was very frustrating. And then at some point, and then my first wife, my ex-wife, was a big Eagles fan, their whole family. And if you remember that Michael Vick era, anytime they would play the Eagles, they'd lose. They have to go up to Philadelphia, the Eagles with Andy Reid, McNabb, and all that. They always had a better record. So the Falcons could do all this great stuff. And then when it comes to January, they go into the cold as a dome team and they lose. And it just, the fact that like we were at that time, Eagles and Falcons were some sort of rivals, just in that they played a lot in meaningful games. And the fact that I started questioning, I was like, what is this all for? Like, what am I doing? And so right around the Matt Ryan sort of ish era, in like 2008 or so, I was just like, I'm too old for this. Like, I just need to have a more healthy fandom relationship with just who do I enjoy watching. Like, it doesn't have to always be the best teams. I wasn't going to revert to 1985 again, but like just having that, that connection and that positivity more of just appreciating good play, good players. I think if I was a 7-year-old again, I would have hated Tom Brady and this Chiefs iteration, but I appreciate greatness. Like, and even if it went against, like if I had a slight preference on one team winning, I still think that like we should all, and Jordan McNamara, friend and co-host he's a Bills fan. And the fact that he can sit there and enjoy Patrick Mahomes as he gets his heart ripped out,
right?
I mean, that really is what we should all root for. I remember the Steeler teams, right? If Brady has just beaten you, I mean, you should be able to appreciate when you see greatness. And I think that's something I would actually transpose to when I was a kid and say, hey, like Dallas was a really good team back then, but these 49er teams, you're not going to get this at all times in the NFL of having true greatness in front of you like that with an organization. You should appreciate it. Now, the 8-year-old would have said, yeah, kick rocks.
Yeah, right.
You're going to be old and bald, and I'm not going to listen to you. Whatever. I'm having fun. So I think that would be something I would definitely tell my younger self, of just appreciate what you're seeing. Because I did that with Michael Jordan. I mean, there was not really some reason. I had no connection with Chicago or family or anything like that. And it was just like, I can't take my eyes off of what I'm seeing. So I could do it with some sports.
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. I was just thinking, when you brought up Bulls earlier, and I was just remembering being a kid in the early 90s and growing up with it always on TV. And the Cowboys were always on TV as well. That's my team. But I can't appreciate the fact that they went to those Super Bowls because I was a kid and, I'm running around playing and having a good time and not paying attention as much as I should. So, yeah, I'm tired of being sad. So maybe I'll take your approach.
That reminds me of a quote and something that I've really put into my life, because it's to appreciate the good times when you're in them, and try to acknowledge that you're in them. Because I've had a number of times, especially traveling around and visiting friends and finding new opportunities, that like trying to recreate that, where like, okay, I was in this location with this group of people, man, wasn't that awesome? And then a year or two later, if you try to recreate that and be like, oh, well, we got to go here and it's going to all be roses and butterflies and it's going to be awesome again, life changes. And so trying to chase that experience is not going to work. And that's like what you were just saying about, like, enjoy that season. If you are a super fan of a team, like enjoy it, ride it like it's going to go broke and run out of gas. Like, what is it? Drive it like you stole it. Yep. Because like when you have that magical season, because I remember that Falcons season when they went 14-2 or whatever it was. I remember when they beat the 49ers twice to win the division. I remember those games to win in the playoffs. I remember just the excitement that they're in the Super Bowl and thinking about that for 2 weeks. And it hasn't happened since. So, whatever team you are, like even if you're a Chiefs fan right now, take every single one so personally that when it's going well, enjoy it, because man, it is so fleeting. I mean, these NFL teams are trying to win, but as a fan, I mean, getting to ride it, like Green Bay last season, like I have a lot of friends that are in Green Bay. I mean, what a great ride, right? Yeah. No expectations. You lose Aaron Rodgers, and it's like, what a fun journey when it's just like, you just got free money and you're just rolling with it. You got this, you're blaring the radio in the car, driving around in high school with your friends. It's like, just keep that moment alive. And they were a play or two away, from going to the Super Bowl, which would have been unbelievable. But just whatever, if your team's good or bad, just when it's going well, I would say just make sure you appreciate that, because it might be years. And in your life, I mean, I will say I had this one experience that, man, I had the greatest like month of, like, again, I already mentioned I'm a big tennis player, and I had this opportunity in Sarasota, Florida, and I met all these great people, and it was just like an unbelievable month or so. And it was just awesome. And I met all these people, and you know what? I went back a year or two later, and whether it's, it was a different time of year. Some people were just more involved with other things, and I was trying to like force feed it. And just know, like, if you're trying to recreate a vacation or, some get together with a certain group of friends, I would say don't do that, because you're raising your expectation. Just say, that was an awesome experience. I really appreciate it. Tell all the people about it. I really enjoyed the time together, but don't try to recreate it at a future point and build it up in your head, because it will disappoint you more than anything. And just let those events kind of come to you and appreciate them when you're there.
That's great advice, and I need to take it. I need to listen to Chad more. But okay, how did you find fantasy football? How did that come into your life?
It was fantasy baseball. Originally, I was the kid looking at baseball cards when I was growing up. And there was one season. So I would do fantasy baseball, and that was through, I believe it was Yahoo. It was back when you were doing dial up and you had to go to the computer lab at college to do anything that wasn't, egregiously slow. And I remember doing fantasy baseball for a few years. And then there was, I think it was around that 1997, 98 kind of zone where there was always that overlap. In baseball, things get serious. You're trying to win your league in September. And there was a year where I picked up fantasy football, and I ended up doing a draft, or I was so interested in it, and football specifically, that I just stopped paying attention. It was like, September 5th or whatever, I didn't check my fantasy baseball league. In fantasy baseball, you kind of got to be in every day, every week. It's a lot more immersive than football, where you can literally take days off. And so one day a week turned into, I forgot to check my matchups for last week. It turned into even a team that was in first place, I ended up not winning because in September I didn't really care. And so I was like, I think that's a sign. Like, that's a clear-cut sign that it's fantasy football now. It's not fantasy baseball. And so I think the next year I transitioned. I played, 3, 4, 5 redraft leagues, and baseball was largely just dead to me, because, or maybe I did something funsy with a friend or two or something, but it was not serious at all. Not that Yahoo was super serious, but when something gets completely ignored in the serious part of the season because the other thing is starting, I mean, I think you kind of know where your allegiance lies there. So that was, and what's funny is, I remember that my first league was the Randy Moss rookie year, which I think was 98. And that was my first year in college. So, but I remember thinking, and again, just coming at it from I watched football, but never played fantasy. And I sat there, it was like late first round. I drafted Randy Moss, which he was one of the greatest college receivers ever. But I mean, drafting a rookie, like looking back, that's, pretty silly. But I drafted Randy Moss. And then I remember saying, well, why don't I just wait and take his quarterback like in the last round? So I took Dante Culpepper, who redshirted his rookie year, and then he was going to be the starter over Randall Cunningham, in that year. And so that combo, I don't even know what else I had, but I went like, undefeated or lost one game or something in my first fantasy league that year. And it's like, oh, this is easy. Oh, it's just so easy. I just got one of the most prolific, rookie producers ever. I found, Dante Culpepper, in one of the last rounds when people were taking quarterbacks in the first and second round and all of that back then. And so so obviously early results help, but just I really love the spacing, the annual thing, the weekly machination of, setting your lineup and then having a pause period before your next game. I also love the fact that, if you watch football, you kind of want to have some level of investment of like, well, I'm kind of coaching my own team here.
Yeah.
So all those elements just really worked well. And I want to say it wasn't even too many years later when Sunday Ticket might have been available already, but once I got out of college, I was able to actually get it. And then Sundays were almost like a football holiday in terms of following the sport. And I was able to watch whatever teams I wanted for the first time in my life. And so that's really where, 2002, 2003, it was like I started playing in more leagues. And, I started a few years after that, started thinking about Dynasty and things like that. So I think from there, it's maybe a more typical progression, but I think that going from baseball to football is something that isn't quite as common for people, especially if you're a little younger. Fantasy football was ramping up in the early 2000s a lot, and fantasy baseball, I mean, I haven't really seen much of a push from that industry to get people back, and I don't even know if that was really, if they did, it obviously wouldn't be successful with how much the NFL has kind of taken over the sports landscape.
Yeah, I tried fantasy baseball for a couple of seasons, and then I was like, I don't have time for it. And then I was doing the same thing, just like forgetting to set lineups or not checking stuff. And I was like, I don't want to waste anybody else's
You really have
time.
to check every day, right? I mean, it really is you don't have days off. Like in the football season, if you wanted to, I don't think you have to be on your computer checking anything fantasy wise, like Friday. You don't technically have to, Monday or Friday or Saturday or maybe even Wednesday. I don't know. But a lot of people just go on there, set waivers, put in their lineup, maybe, respond to a trade offer and call it a day. It can be really, really basic if you'd like it to be.
Yeah. And I mean, those people keep winning my home league. So like,
you're onto something.
Yeah, exactly.
Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is indeed bliss. So when you were talking about Dynasty, how did you decide that you wanted to go from playing in redraft leagues to starting into Dynasty leagues?
Yeah, I think the common path is, and what I always quote people is, if you're one of the best players in redraft, you're probably going to be frustrated that you don't get to keep your team at the end of the year. You've built something up for 4 months, and now in August, they're going to tell you have to do it all again. And to have the idea and the concept of retaining your advantage or retaining the team that you built is a pretty exciting proposition. So that appealed to me. I also, I'm always the type that if you're telling me I love things that are simple yet complicated. So like, for example, this is total, there's a connection here. Just trust me. But
no, I trust you.
But one of my favorite games is Connect 4. And a lot of people will view that as a game for 6-year-olds, but there's actually a lot of strategy to it. So it's simple, yet there's plenty of strategy to it if you want to. Now, if you want to just slide the checkers down on the board, you certainly can do that, but there's also a lot of strategy, if you want to go that way. So I love the simple yet complicated. Dynasty and fantasy in general, everyone's going to tell you it's really simple. Just draft good players. Thanks, genius. But there's also a ton of strategy. So I love how it's a rabbit hole that can be very shallow. It's also a rabbit hole that you can, and a lot of people are proof of this. I mean, you can dedicate a large portion of your working life towards. So you can do whatever span of that you want. And so that's what I find. So it makes it accessible. Like everyone thinks that they can play, I don't know, Foursquare, right? Simple game.
Right.
I'm sure if you see professional Foursquare, there's a lot of strategy to that. Same thing with checkers or, dominoes, or again, these are simple games. You can explain them in 1 minute. So I love the fact that when something is simple yet complicated. And so Dynasty, when you add in the element of time, and all of a sudden, like when I was starting to get into it, how I cut my teeth originally was, and I was already in like a couple leagues, but the first time I started writing about Dynasty, and it was like 2000 and I don't know, maybe 10, 11, something like that, that I would take startup drafts and I would literally write 3,000 to 4,000 words on every single team, on what their approach was, every single position. I would break it down, what they, their strategies, their trades, what were they trying to target, their timeline for winning. And I don't know why, it was almost like an addiction of, I'm fascinated by team building. And I'm fascinating that we're all sitting in 12 people are sitting in a draft room, and almost all of them have different ideas on what is the way to do this. It'd almost be like if you had a speed dating event and you go 5 minutes on each table, everyone's approach is like a little bit different. Like, I want to talk a lot. I want to listen a lot. I want to, I'm trying to, get the most out of this. I'm trying to see if we're going to get married, or like whatever someone's approach is. But it's not to say that any of them are wrong. And I found it interesting to look at a startup draft. And I remember Jim Day was actually my first editor. He gave me my first opportunity, and he was like, you're going on. I would write like all 12 articles in like 1 week. And he was so nice. And he would just be like, this is awesome stuff. And he was like, it was mainly about fantasy overall, but I was going down this Dynasty rabbit hole, and he would just facilitate that and be like, I love your passion. I'm happy to post them. I was just happy to have a place to put it up. But I just remember looking at the whole exercise of a Dynasty team, that it really never ends. And you do the startup draft. It's such an immersive experience. It sets the table for years at a time. Yet we see teams trade, and then they have an annual draft. Like, I was just hooked on the entire experience, because I was like, redraft really is, you see people tune out by November, and then you have to scrounge the league mates back up, and you don't even know if they're going to play again next August. You don't hear from them for 6 months at a time, until you have them reach out with the Yahoo invite or something. You don't even know if they're going to join at that point in time. And it was so different in Dynasty, because people stay plugged in, and there was a lot more things to do, and everything has ramifications. And I just like that whole ownership and investment process, where redraft, I almost felt like it was more speed dating, and it was a lot more like a transient sprint, that we're just trying to get. And the moment you fall out of it, you're like, stop. It's almost like that baseball league. You stop losing, start losing interest in September at the end of the year, because something else has your attention. And I feel like in redraft, it's easy for something else to have your attention when you're 2-4, where in Dynasty, you still have a lot of things to do.
Hey everyone, Kacey Kasem here. I want to take a moment to tell you about Sunday Dreamers Club, my fantasy football inspired t-shirt store. If you're looking for unique, stylish, and comfortable apparel that showcases your love for fantasy football, look no further than SundayDreamersClub.com. Whether you're gearing up for the next big game, hosting a draft party, or just want to sport some awesome gear, Sunday Dreamers Club has got you covered. With a variety of designs and styles to choose from, there's something for every fantasy football fan out there. Your support means the world to me, and there are so many ways you can help me grow this new small business. Grab a shirt or two for yourself, or as a gift for your fantasy football league mates, or you can spread the word to your friends and family. Every bit helps, and I truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening, and now, let's get back to the show.
Right. So for somebody who hasn't played Dynasty before, they've only played redraft. I know I was that person for a really long time that was scared to play Dynasty. I'm like, it's
A lot of pressure.
I don't know. Is it easy? Is it hard? Is it both? I think it's hard. And it's both. It was a lot of pressure, but I finally dove in. People finally convinced me. But what kind of advice do you have for people that are interested in playing in Dynasty? They just don't really know how to get started, or if it's going to be something that they're going to freak out about.
I would say, again, it's like my story about getting Randy Moss and Dante Culpepper. You could have early success, But a lot of times, again, that might lead to actually be worse than if you start out struggling, is what I would say. I would say have reasonable expectations for yourself. It's something new, whether it's a new job, whether it's you're trying to learn a new vocation. There's going to be a steep learning curve usually for things, and so I would say don't pressurize yourself by saying this is the most important league ever and this is the only dynasty league I'll ever be in, and all of us, and whatever your price, whether it's free all the way up, again, there's dynasty leagues that play for thousands of dollars. So I would say make sure you depressurize the situation by saying I'm going to make mistakes, that's what this is for. And I would also say, don't do it at a price point where you really pressurize yourself financially, because you are going to make those mistakes. So whatever a low price point is for you, just get in there. I actually think a lot of times if you get an orphan that's free, like that's, talk about an easy pathway. That's free, and you get a whole year to kind of get in there. You can make some trades. You can figure it out. You don't have high expectations. Heck, the league probably doesn't have high expectations for you taking over that team. So, or maybe it's a dispersal draft. That's a pretty common thing where if you have 2 or 3 openings in a league where they're going to fill all 3 teams, but you're going to draft from just those pool of available players. So I would say anything like that to kind of get you into it, but kind of soft sell it. And then just having those reasonable expectations for yourself of saying, and obviously you can, today versus 20 years ago, you have so many more resources with podcasts, free articles. You actually don't have to spend a penny to get a lot of knowledge base on what is it, some general advice, whether you agree with it or not. 5 years from now will remain to be seen, but you'll find your way. But a lot of people in Dynasty play in more than one league. Heck, a lot of them play in more than 5 leagues. So you joining one, it's something to try out. It doesn't have to be something where that's your only league and forever, and it's going to really declare how good you are at it right away. So I would just say, again, just understanding that you keep your roster forever, understanding that the off season is just as much of a part of Dynasty as it is the regular season, and seeing how it goes and having low stakes and low expectations as you get into it. All those things will really help so that you're not super hard on yourself and you're not saying, well, I was good at redraft and now I'm not good at Dynasty, and all these types of things. Yeah. It really is a different game. So you have to kind of relearn it. Just because you became really good, let's say, at redraft or successful at redraft, it's going to be different when you start changing formats like Dynasty, or what if you go to tight end premium or Superflex or salary cap, all these different elements that could be there, whether it's redraft or Dynasty. You kind of have to relearn or say, how am I going to approach this strategy wise to become good at now this new part of the game?
And when it comes to leagues that you play in now, are you in strictly redraft, strictly Dynasty, both? How does it go? Do you have different kinds of leagues all over the place?
Yeah, I'm mostly, I would say it's 90-something% Dynasty. The redrafts I do, and this is actually a little unfortunate, that those are usually just like Scott Fishbowl or the occasional expert league or something like that, which part of it is a shame. But I will say, like, I am one that, when I went over to Dynasty, like every year I started playing redraft a little less. So I'm the type that redraft sort of has to have something in there for me to join, because it is an extra bandwidth thing in season. And so, my favorite stuff is auction, honestly. And it's I would do redraft auction a lot more than redraft with just the drafting element, just because I enjoy that freedom of a team build more to do whatever you wanted. And I would say that the thing I said initially with you lose your team at the end of the year, that is kind of frustrating. And I have found that even if it's a money league, even if it's, with other, analysts in the space or well-known people, you still see plenty of that, like November, December, people dial out sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I understand it, because there's not really ramifications for doing it. Even if you're playing for money, that person isn't in the money. Like, that's not a part of their conversation at that point. So I understand all that. But part of that makes it a little tougher for me to emotionally invest and commit to redraft and take it as seriously as I do with Dynasty.
I get that. You had brought up writing earlier. So how did that come about? How did you start putting out content on fantasy football?
Yeah. So I just became interested in the process. And back then, again, podcasting, like now I'm much more of a podcaster versus a writer, if you compare words spoken versus words written. But back then, podcasting was very hard in terms of the process that you had to go through to actually do it and then consume it. So writing was really that first. I remember, there were a bunch of fledgling at the time, early 2000s fantasy sites. I remember Footballguys was around back then. I remember there were, Yahoo obviously, and some of the big box brands had content production as part of that. Those were the fixture elements of consumption if you played fantasy. But there was a lot of secondary sites, smaller sites that you just tried to be a contributor. And so I just wanted to be able to write. And frankly, like I always say, like I own a website and I run it and do everything involved with it, but I know enough to know when something's broken, not really how to fix it. I'm sure I've done some tech thing, had someone come on to fix something and they must have rolled their eyes. They're like, how long have you had this site? Because this is an easy fix. They must have gone in there in 2 seconds and fixed something. But to me, it's invaluable because I don't know what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So that has always eluded me in terms of like some big tech guy and coding and all of that. Like the machinations of computers don't interest me, but obviously, being online and having a presence, being able to publish things, that is very interesting. And that's gotten a lot easier. But back then, again, just if you remember, you may not know the name, but Simon Shepard, who now does like the draft nominator for Footballguys, he's from Europe. And I just remember he was actually someone that was developing like a draft app or a draft machine back then when I was with Jim Day. And so I was kind of writing. Simon was, learning about fantasy football so that he could make applications like that. And then Jim was the podcaster. Jim was actually that big personality, loved to record, loved to have conversations. I got to meet him in person. And just, again, one of the most bring everybody together type guys in fantasy. So we had that sort of those 3, 4, 5 of us kind of figuring it out at that point in time. I just love to write, but frankly, I didn't even know about podcasting. Again, I was a kid that I had to kind of find my way in these spots. So I wasn't really much of a talker in the sense of like, you put live on the screen and you say, start speaking or record a show, the pressure's on, go now. Like that's not something I could have done. It took a lot of reps to get comfortable with that. So back then it was all about writing and that was all I knew. I didn't even really explore the podcasting thing for another 5, 6, 7 years after I was writing, just because it was hard to get into. And then B, I always tell people, gravitate towards what you like. And sometimes that's writing. Sometimes it's podcasting. Sometimes it's doing data. Sometimes it's making charts that they put on, TikTok or Twitter. So whatever your niche is, I always say start there. For me, it was writing. And then you can go into whatever you want to, but you kind of have to find that passion, find that success early. And then you might become an all-around guy, or an all-around analyst, because you start doing a bunch of different things, but you still have to start out with one, in my opinion.
And a lot of people write and then go into podcasting. I did that too. And it's just like not easy, but a nice gradual flow into it because you're used to writing about it. Now you can talk about it. It's all, it's all good. But when you started podcasting, like, how did you start podcasting and what really gave you the idea? Like, I need to start that.
Well, podcasting. So I think I started it in 2011, and I always remember Kyle Rudolph, for example, is the guy I always remember because it was his rookie season when I started. So 2011, and that was back when Blog Talk Radio was a big thing. And this was back when MP3 players were a big thing, where to get so for you as a consumer to listen to the podcast out and about in the world, no cell phones, you had to download on your computer, probably at home. Laptops were not as much of a thing. Download the file from the internet to your computer. Then you plugged in your MP3 player. You transferred it over. Now you have this little device. Whether that was, do you remember what was the Apple thing called? It was an I guess it was the big iPod originally. Mm-hmm. The iPods kept getting smaller, and then they just kind of eliminated iPods. Or you had like a Zune, or there were like 5 other brands of MP3 players. And so it was really hard as a consumer. So it was as hard. Like I had to go to Blog Talk Radio. I remember setting this up. And the reason I started one was because, no offense to those that were out there were very few fantasy, but especially fewer dynasty shows back then. And frankly, the biggest one was FFPC centric. I think it was called the High Stakes Fantasy Hour or High Stakes something at the time. But it was like one of the only shows. And I remember just listening, and I downloaded it. It was like a couple times a week or something. I vehemently disagreed with almost everything one of the hosts said. Again, all due respect. Everyone approaches Dynasty differently. But I was sitting there, and it was almost like the Howard Stern effect of like, you listen because you disagree with them. You listen because you almost like you're yelling into the ether as a listener. So they hooked me as a listener because, again, I was interested in the topic and I disagreed with them. But then I was like, at some point, I got to be a part of the solution and not just keep complaining. So I said, well, what if I create a podcast that I would want to listen to? I create one that I think is actually doing good out there and providing just as a good resource. There's not a lot out here for this specific niche. Right. And so I got onto Blog Talk. I figured out I wanted to start it as cheap as possible. And so they had this different, so a primetime spot. And keep in mind, back then, people listened to it live almost as much or more than people downloaded, because downloading was difficult. But people would log on. I remember that High Stakes Fantasy Hour was on like at 10 p.m. Mm-hmm. So I would wake up the next morning, download it, and then I could listen that next day. But people would log in at 10 o'clock. And I remember going on the plans, and it was like, if you recorded at 7 o'clock or later in the evening, aka when people are available to listen,
right,
they would charge you more to make your show. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. Like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm going to start this thing and I just need to figure it out. So I did it at 6:30, which was the latest time to get the free version or whatever the cheapest version of their hosting was. So I would do it at 6:30. I had to call in on my phone. Mm-hmm. And then it's like they literally talk you through. It's almost like you are on the air with the radio. They'd be like 10 seconds until start, all this stuff. And then you had to press the button to do the intro music. You had to get the timing right and all of this. And it would cut you off right at 30 minutes. You could not go a second past 7. So I kind of started out almost doing a live radio show. And again, I mean, it was very pressurized. I took copious notes. And it was just a lot of work for me to have the show ready and do this solo show. I didn't have guests in the beginning. It was just 30 minutes of me. And I thought you have callers. Like, it was a true radio sort of thing. And I've changed a lot since then, but I will say that live aspect really helped cut my teeth to get better fast, because I didn't. And the other thing is, a lot of people these days, they want all these listeners. I'm glad people weren't listening. I had 20 people listen to the first show. My parents were 2 of them probably, but it's just like, it took a while to ramp up and gain that audience. And it's a good thing because you need the reps. Like, if you just get thrown on to, like, a lot of people just want to be famous. And it's like, you're frankly, no offense, you're not good enough to be famous. You're not good enough for that many people to listen. Even if you're on ESPN, people would change the channel immediately. So I just think starting small and working on your craft is super important. And I think having those live reps of no editing, it really got me into a habit of doing the best and then just kind of letting it go. Like, you can't go and change it. There was no editing. And so I function that way now in so many of my shows. It's sparsely and rarely edited at all, because to some degree have the responsibility to do it. I've already had a couple flubs on this show that Kacey may or may not take out, but I think being really aware about your presentation in the moment and doing that hour after hour will improve you a lot faster than spending 2 hours editing your 20-minute show and doing that every single week and getting all the ums out. Just try to take the ums out and work on that instead of just editing them out, because it's going to give you a false sense for people listening and a false sense for you on the take back of trying to analyze yourself.
Yeah. A pause is very nice sometimes when I'm going to say,
dramatic.
Pause for a very long time. It's dramatic. Yes, it's just for the dramatic effect. So putting out or having a website, how did that come about? Why did you decide to start a website? And you've talked briefly about it, but you can explain a little bit more on that as well.
Yeah. Well, again, going back to childhood, I've always been someone that's been kind of internal, someone that has been a solo venturer. So entrepreneur, having your own website, having your own podcast, these things, could have been maybe very predictive. Hey, kid that likes sports, he ends up podcasting and writing about sports on his own website. That's probably not a big reach if you go on the landscape of life there. I would say having a place, because I was big into podcasting. I had stopped writing. I started doing the weekly podcast originally, but then I didn't have a place for the written stuff to go. And so originally it was going to be, well, I need a place for the written content to be housed. And it was also the time where websites were becoming easier to set up. And so that entry point made it easy. And then the other part was I also wanted to have premium shows. I also wanted the concept, and back then it was very not common to have shows that you had to pay for. And so, and I don't even know today, I still think people are very consumed with, I'm going to put out a free show. There may or may not be advertising. And I just want more listeners. I want it to be more popular. I want there to be bigger reach. And a lot of people still don't charge anything for any podcast they ever do. And I've always been the opposite of that. I've always been like at some point you have to start charging to know who likes you and how much, and to see if there's something there. So I came up with an idea, and it was actually originally it was called UTH to go. And I still remember having a conversation with my co-host at the time of saying, and I had some surgery. I can't remember. I think it was, I had my gallbladder out, and I was like on pain pills, and I had to walk like laps in my condo building hallway. Like you had to like do not exercise, but you had to be active, but not do cardio. So I would just walk laps and laps and laps. And I had this idea, and I was like, wait, why do shows have to be a half hour? I was like, why do shows have to be long? And I was like, and then I called him, and I was on all this pain medication. I was like, and I started out by saying, I have this idea. It's either going to be really dumb or really stupid. And I kind of talked about it. And I said, what about we just cover one, like we do a short show. It's like 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops. It's about one thing. Maybe we talk about one trade. Maybe we talk about one player for just a few minutes. And that ended up turning into a lot of what I do today, which is funny. So I figured out a way, to embed that onto the website for like an article. So the article would be such and such show or whatever. And then, so putting out shows on a regular basis, not just the weekly thing, which I was still doing, but now doing it almost daily or just whenever I want. And having that freedom to push, publish was a powerful thing for me, because now, good or bad, any thought in my head, I could record, I could write, and I could publish. And I was already at Footballguys at the time. But as you know, I mean, if you work for a big site, there's tons of positives. Again, love that place. But you can't just push publish anytime you want.
No.
And you can't just put publish about anything you want.
No.
So you put all that together. So it was a really good yin and yang of, I was a small fish in a big pond of Footballguys, but I also had my own website that I was starting, and I was able to, anything that was truly dynasty centric, anything that was really small that I thought was important enough to record on, I could start doing that. And it wasn't like now you can get all the premium shows, on your app and on your phone. And like, it's super easy, just like with any podcast. But starting out, it had to only be, you had to listen to those things through the website. But that's where we were technology wise. So I do think I was kind of pushing boundaries because I really wanted that to work. And it was something where I don't think we should commit to having a really long show if you want to say something small, or save up 5 small things so you can record for 30 minutes or something. So that was one of the bigger early things. In addition to one other thing I would say, which is we started charging at the website with a membership like 3 weeks in. And I think that's not super common unless you're a big name already, just because I think people to some degree are afraid that their following will go away if they charge. And there is a big barrier to that, pressing payment versus, hey, I love you, but that's because you're free and I can just, it's like I'll listen to ads, but everything's free. And I will say it was one of the greatest decisions to ever do, because immediately if you're on the right track of and the confidence you get, even if it's 1 or 2 or 5 at a time initially, of people clicking Yes, I support you. Yes. Even if it's, I mean, back then, literally, it was like $20 a year. Yes, I support what you're doing. I want you to keep doing it in whatever capacity you are and whatever time and energy you have. Yes. And I think there's a confidence, even if it's 100 people, there's a confidence to that builds you as a creator. And I think that's how, Patreon is, I think people think of that for musicians and artists and some of these alt things where it can be difficult to actually get revenue. How do you support someone like that? Well, if they're an artist, they'll make you a t-shirt, they'll show you designs they're working on, all this kind of cool stuff. And you clicking $5 a month really helps them and gets that confidence of you're doing the right thing. Please don't stop. And I think even if it's not a level to say that, I can pay my mortgage, I can, quit all my jobs, I can, this is going to have me retire at 40 years old, like whatever you have in your head that probably won't happen, but just it's going to give you confidence to keep going. And you may get to some of those other places where it pays for your mortgage, it replaces your 9-to-5 job, it does all these other great things. But it starts with just getting the confidence of, oh my gosh, 3 people signed up today. That's awesome. I want to do it tomorrow still, and you start keeping those people. You start getting emails of people like, I'm glad you're charging because now, I get the good stuff, and people off the street that don't sign up, they can't listen to all this stuff that I'm getting or read your articles. So I do think at some point people earlier in the process than they do need to charge for something. If that's Patreon, if that's a website, if that's something, but have some sort of mechanism so that your super fans can support you and show you that love and confidence so that you keep going. Because a lot of people, I think they're obsessed with followers. They're obsessed with the number of downloads their shows have. And they never really find out what super fans will ever go to a second or third level with them and give you that proof of concept that you're doing the right thing. Because a lot of people will listen to a lot of things or consume a lot of things that are free. And at some point, I think you will burn out. I think, actually, I heard Jordan McNamara mention this on a recent show that he said the average lifespan of like a fantasy, a writer or podcaster or something, just a creator, the average lifespan was like 2 years. I don't know where they came up with this, but the burnout I think is real. And the 2 years is probably, hey, I'm writing articles for $5 an article or $10 an article at such and such site, or I'm recording shows and it's for free. Eventually, you're going to have a kid, you're going to have a second kid, someone's going to lose a job, someone's going to get sick, something's going to happen in your world where you're like, something's got to go in my bandwidth. And guess what it's going to be? It's going to be the $5 articles. It's going to be the free podcast, because you're going to like, I need money. I need to spend my time with my family. I need to spend my time doing other things. But I think if you monetize it at some point, you will validate it earlier and it may not be cut. And that lifespan of 2 years of something you actually do enjoy, it can actually perpetuate to much longer. Whether you do it forever or not is immaterial. But I just think, so that would be one of my biggest tips for early creators, is that I just, charging right away was not super common, but going from people have listened to the podcast, people got a little bit of, a few weeks of, you can just sign up on the website, but then eventually going to a membership model and not really giving much since away for free at all on the website has been the best decisions I've ever made, because you're really centering, and the whole focus of my business model has been on knowing people, making them, when they are super fans, answer every single email, make it important to you. Don't outsource those little things, create relationships. I've met so many of them in person, Kacey, like just traveling around. I reach out and say, hey, here's the next few places we're going. If you're there, I'd love to meet up with you. It's been some crazy circumstances. Some have been big group meetups and everything in between, but creating those relationships with people, not just member number 4672, but I know this person because I email them and I respond to them. I know them because they're in the VIP chat room. I know them because I met Aaron in North Dakota last month. Scenarios like that. And part of it is, well, that's just good for business, but part of it is just good for life, creating these connections. And it's not that I'm ever going to need something from Aaron in North Dakota, but I actually like the fact that now when he reaches out via email, I can actually remember when we met. we shared a meal, we know each other, I remember certain things about him, and it goes beyond him asking me a question about a dynasty trade next Thursday.
Yeah. That is so awesome. Like the feeling of people telling you that they enjoy what you do, and even willing to give some of their money to you because they enjoy what you do. It's like, wow, this is crazy and this is cool. Like, wow. And yeah, I don't charge for this podcast, but go to sundaydreamersclub.com and buy a t-shirt, because that is how I monetize this podcast. So if you really love it and you listen to it all the time, I would appreciate that. And if this is your first time, please do it anyway. I love you. All right. So back to the star of the show, Chad. Let's talk a little about the name Under the Helmet. So like, how did that one stick with you, and how did you come up with that?
Yeah, I still remember when I was writing down all these possibilities. And as I'm always the type that you want to throw everything out there, and obviously you're only going to keep one of them. But I remember writing down a bunch of stuff, and it was always football centric genres or wordplay. And then the one that stuck was Under the Helmet. I joke now that there was an era, not so much now, but like a few years ago, when there was all these like alt personalities, if you remember on Twitter, so it'd be like so-and-so's like alt personality. I remember like CD Carter had one, right? And like, but
like a
yeah,
million.
yeah, like, but you'd have all these like secondary be like the opposite of everything that you would say. So now my new one is, instead of Under the Helmet, like I'll actually do some team names that are over the chin strap, so, but like that was the one that was the most benign, if you will. I honestly, like, it sounds like a big decision, but I will say, like, people overthink the like term for something. I mean, it's okay if it changes at some point in the future. Like, don't get brain lock, with you're starting out oh, this is super serious, it's a big business, and the name matters. Like, again, if you're starting a fantasy thing, I don't know, it can be really basic, about but the main thing is starting. It's not so much the branding and all of this, because you might change that as time goes on. You may reiterate it, and that show becomes a different show, becomes a different website. And when you're actually doing it more full-time or more seriously, it may be a completely different iteration. So I would say, looking back on it, I definitely, the name, the logo, like that type of stuff, I overthought it to a higher degree than it needed to be.
Yeah, I find that to happen. Not just with you, with me, with everybody. It seems like that's one of those things, but
paralysis by analysis, right?
Exactly. So, okay, outside of fantasy football, because yes, fantasy football is very important to your life, but I'm sure there's other things that are important to your life as well. And you had brought up tennis, and you had brought up some other things that kind of piqued my interest, but tennis especially. Can you go ahead and just kind of let me know what you like to do in your free time?
Sure. Obviously, as we get into August, September, free time becomes more precious. But yeah, I'm trying to enjoy. I always say that now June and part of July is literally like I'm trying to unplug. I'm trying to do less so that we can enjoy our lives a little more. But yeah, so I played tennis in high school. Once basketball, like freshman year or so, like I stopped basketball. So tennis for those 3 to 4 years, I was on the team. I ended up winning the county and the go to sectionals and all that kind of stuff. So I would say within the high school prism, I was okay. But I ended up breaking my wrist. I took a lot of time off from tennis, and then the last 7 or 8 years, I've taken it a lot more seriously. I always say, like, if I played my high school self right now wouldn't win a game. So I'm a late bloomer in that, but I do take it pretty seriously. Like, it's my main sport or athletic venture besides, like just general working out or going to the gym or whatever. So that's a huge interest. I will say, like, when I started doing all this fantasy stuff, I was active duty military. So I was in the Army for 12 years, and I was the constant like side hustle guy back then. Like, I was in the military. So again, a stabilized assignment. So that makes it a lot easier. But at that time, I was getting super serious with the podcasting. I was already at Footballguys. I was starting my own website. And then on top of all that, I was already walking dogs. And I just have a lifelong passion for animals, and specifically with dogs, that I'm the type that, like if a woman walks by and a dog is on the leash and I turn my head, trust me, it's not looking at the woman, it's looking at the dog. So like, I just love seeing dogs, whether we're driving around or walking around. Like, I'm always the type that wants to go up and pet them and hang out with them and lay on the ground and wrestle around, like instantly, can be friends with dogs. So was already walking dogs at that point in time. That's a huge passion. Frankly, our travels include a good amount of pet sitting. That we have actually built up a lot of connections with that. And this really facilitates, going to places and being able to, stay in really nice houses and meet. I always say, we have dog friends and animal friends all over the country, so that we've seen again. So that's a huge life passion of just wanting to give dogs the best outlet possible that they can. We say it's a staycation, that they don't have to go to the kennel. I mean, when I think of dogs that, like, somebody goes on vacation for the weekend and the dog goes to PetSmart or something, it really hurts my soul that they can't stay home and have folks that love dogs and can't wait to foster a relationship with them, for that amount of time, that they get to stay home and have a great time in their friendly confines. So, again, we can't do that for everybody. Obviously, we're just, two people traveling and can only do it at select times with select people, but, we're at least doing our part, that I feel like it's, really able to, like I said, foster those relationships with all those animals and consider them our furry little friends. So that's a huge passion that dictates, a lot of what we're doing on a, week by week or month by month basis. And obviously, me working on a computer really facilitates and makes that easy. But I would say, and something I heard from, I can't remember if it was like a millionaire mindset thing or if it was just in terms of like having a healthy life. They say you should have a hobby that stimulates you physically and then a hobby that stimulates you mentally. And it probably shouldn't be the same thing. Yes, there's certain activities that certainly qualify and you're kind of thinking about everything you're doing physically. So you could double dip. But for me, fantasy football and that in general is a very cerebral thing. So it definitely strikes that element. And then I would say the physical element, would be the tennis part for me. And then I would say maybe if it's the emotional part, I'm not considered like the most emotional. I'm not wired the most emotionally on the spectrum, but I would say I definitely have a soft spot and that interconnectivity and emotional part for dogs. So I kind of feel like I have created a nice little triad of, the emotion, the intellectual, and the physical, and a lot of those angles there. So, and honestly, that's quite enough, especially for at least the busy part of the year. That's quite enough to fill my days when it's like, well, you're doing waivers, and the next day you're trying to coordinate getting to play tennis, and then you're also dealing with 2 or 3 dogs that you're watching for the week. So it's plenty in terms of my my bandwidth.
Busy life you got there, but we appreciate you putting out the content you do and having the website that you do and all the writing that you do with Footballguys and everything. It's wonderful to have you on the show. Like I said, I'd been listening to you for a long time. You brought up Blog Talk Radio, and I was like, there's a memory that you just unlocked. Like, constantly, I would be getting ready and just listening to Blog Talk Radio and just hearing it live, like you were talking about, and all that other stuff. So yay, fangirl moment. Can you go ahead, though, for everybody that's been listening, just give them kind of a summary of where they can find you, what you got going on, and all of that jazz?
Sure. Yeah. Where you can find me, and it's funny, it seems like every year or two, something else comes up. For folks that were listening, I'll start with the one that most recently changed, which was Jordan McNamara and myself we were on the Footballguys Dynasty show. We did that for a couple of years, and then it ended up being our own brand. So we ended up going off and doing Dynasty Think Tank. So that's a weekly show. That's a free show that we do. There's also a Patreon aspect with bonus content. You can find that, and it's mentioned on every show, but just merely finding that on your podcasting platforms, that'll find us doing that on a weekly basis. And then again, UTH and Under the Helmet has turned into so many different things, and Kacey did such a great job kind of leading me through that journey that it started off with a podcast, which still exists. So the Under the Helmet Weekly show has actually turned into more daily-ish. It's been 6 days a week here in the off season. I had a ton of guests, including Katie earlier in the off season, Kacey, excuse me, and a few others, many that. So it's kind of rebranded itself from previous editions, where there's advertising, a lot of guests, some NFL, some fantasy, all these types of different iterations. So that's still available, completely free. And then, like I mentioned, there's actually a black label, which is the premium shows. You get that at uthdynasty.com. That has all your traditional, what you would expect at Dynasty sites. I will say the Dynasty rankings at UTH, they have more info on that one page than 3 or 4 other sets of Dynasty rankings, I would bet, combined. Things like, age, things like quality years remaining. I have things like, attached quarterback level, years of contract insulation. I mean, there's so many different aspects, whether they're proven or not, and I have different criteria for that. So that's just one aspect, but that's where you get access to the premium show feed, which is 500 plus shows a year. One of the calling cards is when the first 3 rounds, the first 2 nights of the NFL draft, I have a separate show. And this is where, like those short UTH to go shows kind of spawned, but every single player has their own show. So even today, even 2 years from now, you can go back into the feed to 2024 in, late April, early May, and find the show that's on Jaden Daniels, and you can listen to only that show. A lot of places. I used to do a live show for 4 hours at a time in round 1. Well, how do you find, a particular player? Well, good luck. You kind of got to scroll through. You might have to listen for 20, 30 minutes. But I did sort of like an audio book, and sort of that's a good way to think about UTH premium content is you can find what you're looking for or what interests you a lot easier. I don't take offense if a topic doesn't interest you and you don't listen to that one. I get it. You only have time for a certain number of shows. So started doing that last couple of years, so you can find all the guys drafted in the top 100 or so at the skill positions. You find a completely separate show. Got a trade calculator, got a bunch of other stuff. And just know, I always say my last kind of closing foray is I treat running the website, I think, a lot differently than many people running a website. That I view it like a hardware store in the 1980s, where I want to know you. I want to know who you are. People are still surprised when they sign up that I'm the one answering the emails. I'm the one sending the welcome emails. So just know you're dealing with me. You're not dealing with outsourced to any sort of company or someone that's not in this country. Like I have to answer my own questions. I'm not as popular as you might think in terms of like, I can handle all my own communication still. If it was triple this, maybe not, but it's not. And I don't have to worry about that anytime soon. So I'm all about retention. I'm all about creating super fans from the fans I already have and creating a truly unique, developed relationship with everybody that's a listener. And then ultimately, I would love for you to be a subscriber and a super fan. There's so many different outlets from, I mentioned the VIP chat or patreon.com/UTH. There's so many fans to go, so many ways for a fan to go deeper into more content for me. But it starts by listening to the free show. It starts by saying, I would love more of those shows that go more in depth with more topics. And so it really is kind of that funnel, but just know every step of the way that I really appreciate it. And I'm not looking to, have 5 writers and someday in the future, you're going to go to UTH and all the shows are from somebody else. They're not going to be from somebody else. They're going to be from me because I enjoy doing it. I enjoy the entire process from talking with customers and supporting their journey through membership, but also hearing feedback and providing the content that they want. So all those things kind of come together, which is why I think I've lasted as long as I have in the industry, is because I actually enjoy all the processes that are involved with it. And frankly, I mean, part of me thinks, I've always thought, like, if I truly retire, what does that mean? And there's only 2 or 3 things I would take out because I really enjoy so much of the process, which means, to some extent, I'm partially retired now because I'm doing a lot of what I want. And I will say it's a real synergy there because you start being happy with what you're doing and you want to do it a good amount. It's actually a full-time work. It's actually a full-time job, but it's because you enjoy it. It blends recreation with it'd be nice to pay the bills. It'd be nice to, gain money for this. But I would say don't feel like you have to, but yet you want to. Just know that element is really there from a grassroots perspective, and that hardware store perspective of knowing your clients, knowing your customers beyond a number there with Under the Helmet.
Please go check out Chad's work. Go check out Under the Helmet, listen to his podcast, and just tell him that you listen to this show as well and what you learned, because he's got a lot of insightful stuff for us today. Like, I've been taking notes. But yes, come back next time for another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. Go to sundaydreamersclub.com, get you a t-shirt, fantasy football t-shirts right there. Oh, and also remember to come back and stay rad.
Get real. Time to get real, everybody.